Welcome to the Gaggle, where we challenge and, if necessary, destroy media narratives. I'm George Samueli. It is now 9:07 p.m. in a very dark, gray, grim, dismal Budapest, where the very anything resembling the sun hasn't been seen for weeks. Every day has a gray, horrific patina over it, where you're almost begging for night to come because you just can't stand this perpetual grayness. And on top of that, thanks to the EU and thanks to Zelensky, energy prices are through the roof because it's the winter months, and when you're using gas beyond a certain amount, you get absolutely hammered by the Hungarian authorities. I mean, they really punish you. I mean, it's not like you're paying a little bit more or even a lot more for your gas usage. They hit you; you're paying 20 times more through the peculiar way that they calculate it, because they really mean to punish you for going beyond a certain amount in your usage of gas, and you have to use it because it's cold. What are you going to do? You have to heat your home. But so on top of the dismal nature of the outside, there's the dismal nature of the terrible bills that come hitting you. But on the other hand, on a more cheerful note, thank you everybody who has joined me. Really appreciate you. It is now our live stream, a Thursday live stream. And just before I came on, we had two of the least surprising developments ever thundered over the news wires. First of all, some judge in the Ninth Circuit District Judge in Seattle has put a temporary block on enforcement of Trump's birthright citizenship executive order. That was always obvious it was going to happen. Naturally, the Trump's opponents went to the most friendly forum, which is what they did when he tried to impose immigration restrictions during his first term. They went to the most friendly forum, and that means in the Ninth Circuit, and they always got judges to vote in their favor. And so this judge, who is apparently a Trump appointee, not a Trump appointee, but a Ronald Reagan appointee, which means that he has to be quite elderly by now. But it's actually quite funny that the Reagan appointees have actually been among the most hostile to Trump. So in the January the 6th cases, there was a Reagan appointee. I can't remember his name, but he was always the most ferocious in dealing with the January the 6th defendants. He really wanted to send them to prison. I mean, and he wanted to lock them up and throw away the key. And I think, as Julie Kelly invariably described him, I mean, he was old and could barely move around. I think he had to be helped in and out of his chair. So he seemed to barely know where he was. But what he did know is that these people needed to be punished, and punished hard. So this was a Ronald Reagan appointee. But as I said the other day, I mean, there's no question that this whole issue of the meaning of the 14th Amendment, and in particular those words, and subject to the jurisdiction thereof, what exactly those words mean, will eventually be decided by the Supreme Court, and then that's anybody's guess how that's going to go. So anyway, that was always and so Dr. Nostrum says, Article 1 of the 14th Amendment is pretty explicit. Legislation may limit what constitutes being a resident of the United States and subject to U.S. jurisdiction. Yeah, no, I mean, I don't doubt that. I don't doubt that. I think that having put that in there, it means that you don't get birthright, you don't get citizenship just by dint of being born in the United States. Because if that's what they intended, then they would have said it. It's very simple. You can just simply say it, and then if you're born in the United States, then you're automatically a U.S. citizen. But that's not what they said, and that's why they put in those qualifying words and subject to the jurisdiction thereof. So I think the Trump interpretation, and it's been an interpretation made by others, is a reasonable one. But we'll see what the Supreme Court decides. And then the other thing that came over the wires was the um, the news from Lisa Murkowski, the senator from Alaska, who caucuses with the Republicans, but he's really a Democrat. She intends to vote against Pete Hegseth. I don't think there's anybody who really doubted that Lisa Murkowski would vote against um, uh, Pete Hegseth. So it was a big nothing of a decision. But again, it's always interesting what she and Collins, who are always troubled about Republican nominees, but when it comes to Democratic nominees, they never seem to have any problems. They always vote for them. It's only Republican nominees that they have problems with, and yet they caucus with the Republicans. Um, Murkowski is a particularly egregious case because, I mean, at least Collins is a Republican senator from a blue state, and so she has to think about getting reelected in a blue state. Now, Alaska is not a blue state, and the Alaska Republicans had actually got rid of her. I mean, they actually had primaried her and had turfed her out some years ago, and but that didn't do them any good because then Murkowski, and basically it's a family dynasty in Alaska. I mean, she like many politicians like Liz Cheney and the rest. I mean, this just it's always a dynasty. So it's a Murkowski dynasty in Alaska, and she was not at all happy about being turfed out by the Republicans. So she decided to run as an independent, and then of course the Democrats, realizing what problems she was going to make for the Republicans, would invariably vote for her. And so that's how she would win. So how she'd be up against a Republican, and a Republican would lose because the Democrats would support Murkowski. So but Mitch McConnell, that is the former Senate Minority and Majority Leader, he wanted to increase the membership of his conference, and so he would support her rather than her Republican opponent. So now, on the subject of Trump, typically the criticisms that are coming of Trump are always the most stupid and irrelevant, as you can imagine. So, every day you look at CNN or MSNBC, and of course all the newspapers and so on. They're still going on and on and on about January the 6th. A very, very stupid line of argument because that's been litigated. I mean, you've basically had 4 years in which to make the case about January the 6th. You failed to make the case. It was clear from the polls that were conducted before the election that no one cared about January the 6th other than journalists. So Trump is not going to suffer any adverse consequences from you know pardoning the January the 6th defendants. or commuting the sentences of the rest of them. So he's not going to suffer. So there's no point in going on and again wildly exaggerating, hysterically exaggerating what happened on January the 6th. Oh, there was a mutiny and an insurrection, an attempt to overthrow the government. I mean, this is, again, you've had 4 years to make the case, 4 years in which to suggest that this was an insurrection. Couldn't do it. 4 years to make the case that there was horrific violence directed at the police. Well, no, there wasn't horrific violence directed at the police. There was the usual argy-bargy and pushing and shoving between police and protesters, the kind that you get at every demo. And some people then throw a punch at a police officer, and then what usually happens is that they go to court and they get hit with a fine, with a misdemeanor, and then that's it. They don't go to prison for years and years and years for throwing a punch at a police officer. I mean, it's obviously thoroughly undesirable to throw punches at police officers, but nonetheless, this hysterical overwrought talk about violence directed at the police, it's not impressive. It's not getting anywhere. Anyway, that's the stuff that you get on in the media, and but some of the more egregious aspects of Trump are somehow being ignored. So we had Elise Stefanik, who is the Trump administration's nominee for the United States permanent representative to the United Nations. She's a congresswoman from New York, and we kind of remember her from the way she was badgering absurdly the presidents, I think, of Harvard, MIT, and I think UPenn, and talking in this ridiculous way about somehow that they were sanctioning genocide and whatever because they allowed Palestinians to express, the words "from the river to the sea, Palestine will be free," which Elise Stefanik said, "Oh, this is genocide," and that therefore these universities, these prestigious universities, were somehow lending their imprimatur to genocide, to the genocide of the Jews. It was a totally ridiculous, stupid argument. But she got a lot of praise from the Fox News crowd, and naturally Trump also was praised her. But anyway, she's now the nominee, and she said during her confirmation hearing that she believed that Israel had, Israel's right to the West Bank is guaranteed by the Bible. That it's a biblical prophecy, and that therefore that's it. It's basically it belongs to Israel because the Bible said so. Now, that's quite an extreme view. It's the view of quite extreme figures in Israel, Ben Gvir, for instance, and Smotrich. That's their view. It's also the view of Mike Huckabee. Basically, that land of the West Bank is designated to Israel by the Bible. And she said this at the confirmation hearing. Of course, she didn't suffer any adverse consequences. It wasn't hardly even reported. But it's certainly extremely troubling that you're getting this sort of approach from members of the Trump administration. And let's keep in mind that Israel, while it's not doing anything in Gaza at the moment, is kind of conducting operations in the West Bank, and therefore, he basically seems to be signing off on that. He certainly hasn't expressed any disapproval of Israeli operations on the West Bank. So now, so you have that. Then we had the bizarre spectacle in the White House the other day with this announcement of this $500 billion investment in AI with Larry Ellison, the Oracle founder, going on about using AI and this gene sequencing to essentially vaccinate you against cancer. In other words, that somehow, to the extent that one can understand it, I mean, the guy there's no medical qualifications, no scientific qualifications. But that's true of all of these billionaires who pontificate about vaccines, like Gates. They suddenly all pretend to be scientists and medical practitioners. But the idea being that with AI, you do a blood test, and they detect some cancer cells, and they can quickly do a genetic sequencing, um, and then on the basis of that genetic sequences, they can they're going to vaccinate you, a unique vaccine, because everybody's genetic sequence is different. So they're going to develop a unique vaccine per unique individual. And this is all thanks to AI. Now, you look at that and say, well, that sounds like a total fraud to I mean, they're obviously going to make a huge amount of money. I mean, can you imagine for every individual, they're going to develop their unique genetic sequence and then have a vaccine based on that unique genetic sequence, all done within 48 hours, and then inject you with the vaccine. Naturally, the pharmaceuticals who will develop these vaccines will enjoy immunity. So not only will you have to pay, I don't know, $500,000 presumably for this vaccine that will be available to you within 48 hours, but when the tumor returns, you're going to get another vaccine. Like with the COVID. You keep getting these further vaccines, so that when one vaccine turns out not to work, you have to get a second shot to remedy the problems with the first shot, and then you have to get a third shot to remedy whatever problems arose from the second shot. So that there's a lot of money involved here, and the people who had supported Trump and who really were not big fans of vaccine mandates, now finding, well, whoa! I mean, this is going way beyond anything that we had seen with COVID, because essentially we're getting this. It's a kind of an mRNA vaccine, which means that it's not really a vaccine. It's about genetic manipulation. That's the way you get rid of the tumor. You kind of manipulate the genetic code. And this is a boondoggle for the pharmaceutical companies, and Trump seems to be endorsing this. And so we just come out of COVID and the mRNA vaccines, and Trump, of course, did push for this huge vaccine project. Though that's kind of been forgotten, once Trump became this martyr, with the Biden administration went after him, so that was all forgotten. And then Trump kind of lamely said, "Yeah, I know I pushed for the vaccines, but I didn't really push for the vaccine mandate. It's the mandates that I have an objection to." Well, here he's obviously pushing for vaccines. I mean, this is all part of this AI project, And interestingly, Elon Musk doesn't seem to be at all on board. He was actually very scornful of this project, again from which he was being excluded, which itself is interesting because he himself is um, he himself is involved with AI. But this meeting with AI, well, he wasn't included, and so he sent out these tweets or X's ridiculing this project and ridiculing above all that they could ever come up with $500 billion. Says, the most they're going to come up with is $10 billion. Anyway, so that's that's not a good project. Now, the more serious issue is, of course, Trump's sudden pronouncements, sudden on the issue of Russia and Ukraine. So, as you know, he delivered an address today to Davos. He didn't go to Davos, even though there was speculation that he would go to Davos. But he gave an address from the White House to Davos, and he said familiar things about we're getting ripped off by the EU. We have a trade deficit with the EU, and we buy their products, but they don't buy our products. And the Europeans that aren't coughing up the money for NATO, and it's got to be 5% that they spend, and then he got on to the subject of energy, and it's a particular a familiar complaint of his that the Europeans had become dependent on Russian energy, and that's what led to Trump, or rather, that's what led to Putin's launching the so-called special military operation. Now, and so he now intends, which is something that he's already said many times before, he intends to increase massively American energy production. Now, he takes his guidance from what Ronald Reagan did. Ronald Reagan in the 1980s did massively increase American energy production, and that led to collapse of world oil prices, led to big losses among American oil tycoons, including the great John Connolly. So there was a lot of people went bankrupt when oil prices plummeted during the 1980s. But above all, he did this to bring the Soviet Union down. Now, I don't think the Soviet Union went down because of collapsing oil prices, but nonetheless, this is what the Reagan's fans and Trump believe, and so that's what he intends to do, and that it goes together with his proclamations. The other day, I played this the other day when we were with Peter, and let's see if we can take another look at this. It's kind of interesting. What he said. Can I see it? Nope. Nope. It's not there anymore, is it? Nope. All right, let's try something else. Let me. So.
I'll be meeting with President.
Let me try this. See if I can play this now. Okay, let's try playing this now. This is not working either. Well, some of the audio.
I'll be meeting with President Putin. I don't know. I can't. It's being set up. But Zelensky wants to make a deal. I don't know if Putin does. He might not. He should make a deal. I think he's destroying Russia by not making a deal. I think Russia's going to be in big trouble. You take a look at their economy. You take a look at the inflation in Russia. So I would hope. I got along with him great, and I would hope he wants to make a deal.
Mr. President, are you keeping U.S. sanctions on Russia until he makes a deal?
Well, sanctions or tariffs. I think the word tariff is much better because it keeps your dollar stronger.
You called for a ceasefire in Ukraine. If Vladimir Putin doesn't come to the table to negotiate with you, will you put additional sanctions on Russia?
Sounds likely.
And do you think that the war should be frozen currently along
The war should have
battle
never
lines?
started. If you had a competent president, which you didn't, the war wouldn't have happened. The war in Ukraine would have never happened if I were president.
Are you going to keep sending weapons to Ukraine, or are you going to turn off the tap soon?
Well, we'll look into that. We're talking to Zelensky. We're going to be talking with President Putin very soon, and we'll see how it all happens. We're going to look at it very soon. One thing I do feel, the European Union should be paying a lot more than they're paying because under Biden, I mean, we're in there for $200 billion more. Now, it affects them more than it affects us. We have an ocean in between, right? Little thing called an ocean. The European Union should equalize. We're in there for $200 billion more than the European Union. I mean, what are we, stupid? I guess the answer is yes, because they must think so.
All right. So that gives us a sense of what Trump is thinking. And it's clear that the analysis that had been put forward by so many people in the alt media, that Trump was somehow going to push Zelensky under the bus. Trump was going to cut Ukraine off. Trump was going to say, enough already, enough is enough. We're not, Ukraine, this is of no interest to us, no national interest to us. Who cares about Ukraine's eastern border? And he's just going to say, no, we've got other fish to fry, China, whatever. Basically, we're going to cut Ukraine off. Oh, no, not going to get anything. Now, I have never argued that. I've never believed that. And it's clear that Trump, he doesn't care about Ukraine, but that doesn't differentiate him from anyone else in the West, whether the Europeans or whether the Biden administration, they don't care about Ukraine. What they're interested in is keeping the war going. So what's interesting in these comments is that he more or less blames Russia. He says Zelensky wants a deal. I'm not sure that Putin wants a deal. He should want a deal, and but I don't know if he does. And so then he was asked perfectly reasonably. So if he doesn't come to the negotiating, if Putin doesn't come to the negotiating table, will you sanction him? And he said, yeah, I think it sounds likely. So he's already got the mentality that the problem lies with Putin. So it's exactly the opposite of what all of these predictions, all of these blogs and all these podcasters, that he's going to somehow say that it's all Zelensky's fault. That's not what, and that he doesn't like Zelensky, and he thinks Zelensky is just a crook. He's taking American money, and all of this. It's a pure fantasy. And what he's saying here about he should make a deal. He said Putin should make a deal because he says Russia's economy is going to have problems. And you have to say Russia's economy will indeed have problems. And Trump is going to make additional problems for Russia's economy. Now, the terms of tariffs and all the rest about that somehow he's going to impose tariffs on Russian products, that's nonsense, because of course Russia and the United States don't really do very much business, and therefore, tariffs aren't going to make any difference. But the energy thing is going to make a difference, because Russia does make a lot of money through its energy exports. So, and basically, if world energy prices will go down, then Russia's revenues will decline. But there's other problems with Russia's economy. I mean, there is a very high inflation rate, and in Russia, as in the United States and in many other countries, the real inflation is being deliberately concealed by the statistics. And so therefore, when people say, well, the inflation rate is 9%, well, in fact, it's much greater than that, because the prices of things that matter to people, which is food primarily, they have gone through the roof. I mean, people are paying for bread, potatoes, eggs, the staples. Those have gone up by 40, 50, 60%. And those are important. So those are real issues. In the inflation rate, interest rates currently 21%. That's a high interest rate. And obviously the inflation rate is being driven by the cost of the war and the cost of paying for these bonuses. I mean, Russia has undertaken this model of they're not going to have mobilization. They're not sending conscripts to fight. So they're only sending volunteers. Well, how do you send volunteers? Well, you have to pay them a lump sum, a big pot of money. Well, if you think about it, well, how many people sign up each year? Well, maybe it's about 400,000. 400,000 sign up each year, which incidentally, as I said before, I don't think that's enough really to conduct the kind of big military operations that you need in order to win decisively. 400,000 a year isn't enough. But anyway, 400,000, and you pay each person a very large lump sum to make it worthwhile for somebody to sign up for a likely death. That's costing a lot of money. That's on top of all the other costs of waging a war. And so therefore, it's a serious issue. And therefore, you have to realize that, and I think Trump does it. Trump is he has an instinctive understanding for for business and economics, and that says, I think you should make a deal, because we, the Americans, we haven't suffered, and we're not going to suffer. We're not going to send our forces there, but we can make you suffer. And so he says something like, well, we can do it the easy way, or we can do it the hard way. It's better if we do it the easy way. So in other words, we can make you suffer, but you can't make us suffer. And so that's why that's what he's saying. And if he, after he's obviously going to spend the next 6 months engaging in some kind of diplomacy, shuttle diplomacy. Maybe they'll meet. Trump and Putin will meet. I'm having doubts whether there'll be a meeting, given his pronouncements, especially now with these latest pronouncements in which he's somehow blaming Russia for the continuation of this war rather than Ukraine. That's just going to annoy the Kremlin and say, well, then you haven't really, you're obviously come with an attitude of a very prejudicial attitude towards us, as there's no real point in meeting and talking. So he's going to say, I mean, if he was going to come in and say, well, I'm going to be even-handed in all of this. I'm not going to take any sides. I just want to bring it to an end. That would be one thing. But for him to say, well, that Zelensky wants a deal, but I'm not sure Putin wants a deal. And Putin only launched this war because of energy prices. Because energy prices were high. Again, he blames the Biden administration for the rise in energy prices. I said, well, that's why Putin did it, because energy prices were nice and high in February 2022, and so he was making a lot of money, and so he could go. I, however, will lower the prices, and therefore it's not going to be worthwhile for Russia to continue. And that's why, if you've got inflation and high interest rates, and Trump is going to apply the pressure through massive energy production. Well, that's not as I've been saying throughout, Russia should have wrapped this up long ago, because the longer the war goes on, the more uncertainty there is, and the more things can go wrong. And the hope that people had that somehow, well, once Biden's gone and the new team comes in, somehow things will improve. I also it was fatuous. I think things are going to get worse with Trump, because he's going to go through this shuttle diplomacy for the 6 months, and then he's going to say, look, I did my best. I said to Putin that I think it's in your interest, and that was the thrust of these comments, and as well as the truth that he sent out, the one where he claimed that Russia lost 60 million during World War II. He's saying, look, I'm on your side. I'm well disposed towards you, but this doesn't make any sense. I'm trying to help you. I'm trying to help you get yourself out of this mess. But if then the Russians turn around, or at least this is Trump's thinking, if the Russians turn around and say, well, we want to continue with this war, then I think it's going to get worse. I think he's going to escalate in ways that Biden wasn't prepared to escalate. I think it'll become a lot more dangerous, and I think he's going to apply a considerable amount of economic pressure. And as I've said, the economy, just simply assuming that the economy is going to go really well. Well, no, I mean that's not that you can't assume that. So that's why I think it's not a happy situation, particularly that Russia really can't settle for what's being presented to him as the Trump team. I mean, the Trump team is saying, look, we'll freeze the conflict in place right now, on the line of contact, which is simply boom, freeze it. And all the talk about, Ukraine in NATO, we'll put that on the back burner. Now, what happens then? Do these, the Europeans want to send peacekeepers, this ridiculous idea of sending peacekeepers into Ukraine, which of course they're not going to be peacekeepers. They will essentially provide an occupation force that they're going to put Ukraine under some kind of NATO military occupation. So it'll be a kind of de facto NATO membership. I mean, that's why they keep talking about, well, let's sing in the peacekeepers, because if you want to send peacekeepers as observers, that's very fine. When you have a ceasefire, you send international observers, and then they report as to who's violating the ceasefire, and then they report back whether to the United Nations, the OSCE, or say, well, there was this violation and that violation. But that's not what the Europeans have in mind, and that's what Europeans are saying. Oh no, we want to send in peacekeepers. So they have a very different idea of what a peacekeeper is, and therefore it's essentially a provocative act, much as Minsk was a provocative act, so that it's a way of keeping the war going and seeing whether will Russia be provoked into attacking these so-called peacekeepers, or will Russia be intimidated from doing anything, and that way Ukraine effectively becomes a member of NATO, and Russia will have been intimidated from doing anything to deal with essentially a NATO occupation force. So it's a deliberate piece of lying about, we're going to send the European peacekeepers into Ukraine. So we'll see whether Trump buys into that, because the moment you send European peacekeepers, you're going to have to send in the Americans. The Europeans can't do anything on their own. They can only the logistics, the transport, the engineering, the construction, everything depends on the Americans. So the airlift, it'll all be provided by the Americans, and above all, if they do come under fire from the Russians, they need a backup plan, and that's the Americans. So I have my doubts whether Trump will go for it, but you never know. But anyway, if that happens, then essentially Russia will have failed, and it's hard to see how any Russian leader can survive if you've basically got to the position where you haven't secured, at a minimum, the Donbass. So the Donbass now is entirely within the Russian Federation, and and at least Kherson and Zaporozhye are in the Russian Federation. I mean, even that I'm not sure addresses Russia's security problem, but nonetheless, at least it will have been an accomplishment. But if you have a ceasefire now on the current line of contact, then Russia will have not achieved anything, and I don't see how Russia could possibly agree to something like that. But that's going to be the offer presented by Trump, and Trump was going to say, well, you've been fighting for 3 years, more than 3 years. You haven't won. And so your best bet, rather than just go on destroying your country, destroying your economy, is to take this deal. And if Russia doesn't take the deal, then he'll turn around and say, well, look, I made an offer. I was very reasonable. I was being very friendly. I said, hey, I only want what's best for you. I don't want to see you destroy yourself. I made the offer. They didn't take my offer. Now, we can do it the easy way, or we can do it the hard way. I'm going to escalate. And I think that's going to be Trump's thinking. Because I don't see how this deal that he's offering, and we can more or less figure out the outlines of this deal, how this deal could be acceptable to Russia. I think any Russian leader who accepted that deal would be done. I mean, I don't see how you can survive. I think Putin couldn't survive politically if he did that. And then again, I mean, so that's why I think that there may come a moment when the Russians will feel, hey, things were better when Biden was in charge, as they felt, incidentally, during Trump's first term. I mean, maybe they were more optimistic about that as to what Trump could deliver for them, but I don't think that they have any real any good prospects. I mean, again, you have to win wars. That's all one can say. You have to win them. If you don't win them, then you've got all sorts of problems down the road. Then it goes, all sorts of uncertainties. New political leaders emerge, new pressures emerge, and your economy starts to become a little problematic. Anyway, let's take a look at some of the comments on our Gaggle page, Gaggle Locals page, which is of course the key where all of our supporters, subscribers log in. The people who maintain this savage dogs in the life that they appreciate. Anyway, Danaki, always good to see you. Danaki says, Kedvesh George, dear George, isn't it swell to watch MAGA idiots slavishly swallowing hook, line, and sinker this whole mRNA AI cancer vaccine bullshit, or alternatively inventing yet again more pathetic bullshit excuses about Trump being led by the nose. Oh, wait, which other idiot being constantly led by the nose, left, right, and center? Or the moronic line about keeping enemies closer. What enemies? These psychos are out there to get you, and they will unless people finally wake up. Yeah, I guess so. Having said that, I do notice that not everyone in MAGA world was entirely enthused about that whole presentation at the White House yesterday. So um, I watched some of Bannon, and Bannon had people there who were very unhappy about this, because it's AI, it's mRNA, it's vaccines, and it's Larry Ellison. So you got a kind of a perfect combination of entities that MAGA really has very little time for. So I don't think they were quite that taken in by it. I think Trump kind of stunned MAGA by pulling that really on his third day in office. He has this presentation. You talk about a vaccine cancer, no, a vaccine for cancer. You start talking about using AI to plot your individual gene structure, and then you design a vaccine, a unique individual vaccine, and then of course if that doesn't work, then you have to take your second dose of the vaccine, and I mean, everyone. This is, we've had a rise of cancer following the whole introduction of the COVID vaccines. So we have this rise of cancer. Now you're coming up with a vaccine for cancer, to address the cancer problem that was caused by the last vaccine. And the money that we're talking about, how much of these pharmaceuticals are going to be making, these are just staggering numbers. I mean, if you imagine a unique, every individual gets a unique vaccine within 48 hours. Can you imagine just the amount of money that it's going to cost you? And then you're going to have your second dose. So this is this was a terrible presentation. And I said, look, if even Bannon, who spends most of his time cheerleading for Trump, ranting and raving 4 hours a day about the glories of Trump, like some starstruck 16-year-old, if even he found it hard to stomach this kind of talk about mRNA cancer vaccines, then you'd have to say this is not going to go down well. I think this is going to be put on the back burner. I tend to think. I mean, yes, Trump likes these big projects, and he likes this kind of hey, I'm bringing jobs back to America, and so on. But going down this path, with AI, AI surveillance. Again, Larry Ellison. This is somebody who is a real surveillance nut. So you're going to have AI, there's going to have mass surveillance. That's why we voted for Trump, to massively increase the surveillance of every individual. That's why we voted for Trump, to have more vaccines. So I don't know. I think this is a total disaster, and I think it was interesting that even Musk very quickly distanced himself from it, which again raises questions about the future of this Trump Musk relationship. So we already have Vivek Ramaswamy. He's gone, and I don't know. There's no particular reason why Musk is going to hang around. I mean, this is a guy who's he's used to being number one. He's used to basically getting his own way, running huge companies. I getting with the Trump program, I think is going to be difficult. So I'm not sure that Musk is going to be around for much longer. Anyway, Marty, always good to see you. Marty says Russiagate Redux, unredacted. We've got a book to sell. We've got a book to sell. So let's take a see what's this the book. This is try to zoom in on the book, unredacted. This is taking forever. All right. It's unredacted. Okay, so Chris Steele, former British Secret Intelligence, in conversation with journalist Luke Harding. Huh. Boy, that's a must read. Chris Steele. When did he become a Chris? I mean, he was always known as Christopher Steele. Suddenly he became Chris. My good friend Chris. When did that happen? Anyway, Chris Steele, former British Secret Intelligence, in conversation with journalist Luke Harding. So Luke Harding, Steele were the chief purveyors of the Russiagate nonsense. And Luke Harding wrote that book. I think it was called Collusion. He wrote an entire book, Collusion, about the supposed Trump-Russia collusion in 2016. And he didn't have a single fact, a single piece of evidence to support that dramatic book title, Collusion. And again, if I'm sure people have seen it, but you can still find it, I think, somewhere on the internet, at the interview of Luke Harding by Aaron Maté. And Maté just simply tears apart Luke Harding. I mean, just continually he challenges Harding to present some evidence for his claims about the Trump-Russia collusion. And Harding had nothing. He's written a book promoted by The Guardian, and there's nothing in it. But now a conversation between Luke Harding and Christopher Steele. Robert, always very good to see you. Thank you so much, Robert, for your generosity. And he says, "Good evening, George." Good evening, Robert. So, in an article, you say, yeah, this is what happens when you're living in these apartments where they hit you with, gas bills, that are 20 times as much as they are usually, just to punish you for using too much gas. You start sneezing. But anyway, in an RT article, Robert Fico, the Slovak leader, says U.S. European embassies are orchestrating a Maidan-style coup against Slovakia. Yeah. Could you give a brief history of Czechoslovakia, formed after World War I, how it's separated back into two countries, why the Czechs are so pro-US, why the Slovaks not so much? Do you expect that Orban, a Fico ally, will try to use his influence with Trump to put a stop to this coup? Well, it's very interesting because Czechoslovakia, obviously was made up of what's now the Czech Republic and then Slovakia. And the Czech Republic consisted of Bohemia and Moravia, which were part of Austria, and but Slovakia had been a part of Hungary. Now, the leading forces within Czechoslovak nationalism had been the Czechs, in particular Thomas Masaryk, who was a kind of a famous psychologist, wrote a number of books about psychology. Was was an academic, and Edward Beneš. So it was Masaryk and Beneš. So they were both Czechs, and they really essentially had pushed for the dissolution of the Austro-Hungarian Empire. But the important thing was that part, the Czech part, the Bohemia and Moravia, that was Austria. So therefore, they had some, links more to the kind of Austrian German culture, whereas Slovakia had been a part of Hungary. I mean, Bratislava, not what we call Bratislava, the capital of Slovakia, was a Hungarian city, Pozsony. But anyway, once the in the aftermath of defeat in World War I, they formed the state of Czechoslovakia, but there was the Slovaks were really never very happy with it. But they took their lead from Masaryk and Beneš. Now, as you know, I mean, of course, there was several problems with the state of Czechoslovakia that was created. An important part of which was, of course, the presence of a very substantial German population. Because it was, as I say, it was part of Austria, so there was a very substantial German population, and they were mostly located in the Sudetenland. Not wholly, but they were mostly located in the Sudetenland. And that, of course, it was going to be a problem because, of course, if you create states on the principle of national self-determination, and Austria and Hungary were attacked for denying national self-determination to all these different nations that lived there because they were all subordinate to the two titular nations of Austria-Hungary, namely the Austrians and the Hungarians. But so they were particularly the Hungarians were attacked, denounced, and despised by kind of the liberal Europe because they were denying all of these wonderful nations their right to self-determination, not just the Slovaks who were up in the north, but of course the Romanians in Transylvania. Then there were Serbs down in the south, and so Hungarians were just really reviled by liberal opinion, and there was a particularly obnoxious figure in the English world, a man named Robert Seton Watson. And Robert Seton Watson wrote many, many books, before the First World War, particularly focusing on the denial of national self-determination to the non-Hungarians, the non-Magyars within Hungary. And obviously the Romanians, and of course the Slovaks. And then Robert Seton Watson, served as a kind of an advisor to the Paris Peace Conference. So anyway, they sliced up Hungary, and everyone went their own way. But even though the Hungarians were, of course, denied national self-determination because the Hungarians found themselves living in states belonging to others. So, they'd once lived in Hungary. Now suddenly they became a minority in someone else's state. In particular, they became a minority in Czechoslovakia. As I say, Slovakia had been Hungary, now became Czechoslovakia. And so there was a very substantial Hungarian minority that was now living in Czechoslovakia. But anyway, once Hitler came along and he raised the issue, that same issue that everyone else would be talking about, the same issue that we're talking about the Paris Peace Conference and Woodrow Wilson, Robert Seton Watson, national self-determination, then it was going to be inevitable that the question of the Germans who were living in Czechoslovakia and weren't terribly happy about being a minority within essentially a Slav-dominated state, these Germans said, no, we want to be a part of this greater Germany that Hitler had created. And it was now a greater Germany because Hitler had annexed Austria, following the Anschluss. And so they said, hey, we want to be a part of this. Of this greater Germany. And of course, then we have the Munich Peace Conference, and essentially Sudetenland was transferred to Germany. What then happened was the state of Czechoslovakia, the remnant with the loss of Sudetenland, just simply collapsed. The basic differences between the Czechs and the Slovaks just became too great. Slovakia went its own way, and then Bohemia and Moravia, which was this what was left of Czechoslovakia, which was now is the Czech Republic, it became a German protectorate. And there was another part of that, which was Hungary, which was this what's now known as Transcarpathia, but which at that time had been a part of Czechoslovakia. So that part of Czechoslovakia, again following the collapse of Czechoslovakia, that part of Transcarpathia was then transferred to Hungary. But anyway, that after the war, Transcarpathia was not returned to Czechoslovakia, but it was attached to the Soviet Union. I mean, obviously, it was a part of Ukraine, the Soviet Socialist Republic of Ukraine. It was attached to Ukraine, but what was important was that it was now part of the Soviet Union. But otherwise, other than that, Czechoslovakia was restored to the borders that it had prior to the Munich conference. So there's still Czechoslovakia. The Sudetenland was restored to Czechoslovakia, and but minus the Germans. So the Sudeten Germans were all picked up, lock, stock, and barrel, thrown out without any compensation or anything. They were just thrown out of Czechoslovakia. And then, Czechoslovakia then really went into a whole quite vicious prospect. Again, they throw out the Germans without any worries one way or the other about it. They were just picked up lock, stock, and barrel. But that applied also to the Hungarians. The Hungarians were also thrown out. Those are the Beneš decrees. Not all the Hungarians, but a very substantial number of Hungarians were thrown out of Czechoslovakia through the Beneš decrees. So that was it. But here, what was interesting, is that Czechoslovakia became part of the Soviet bloc, which is rather interesting because there were never any plans to make Czechoslovakia part of the Soviet bloc. If you recall, the wartime agreements signed between Stalin, Churchill, and Roosevelt, they applied to Hungary, they applied to Romania, they applied to Bulgaria, Poland, the Baltic states, which were transferred to the Soviet Union, and then Yugoslavia was left up in the air as to whoever's going to win out in Yugoslavia. Greece was assigned to the West, but there was no talk about Czechoslovakia. but what happened, why Czechoslovakia ended up in the Soviet bloc, was that the communists staged a coup. Well, it wasn't particularly, I mean, it wasn't Stalin who authorized this. The communists, were very emboldened. They staged a coup, and they took power. And the hapless leadership of Edward Beneš really provided no resistance at all. I mean, the communists were the largest party in Czechoslovakia, but they were by no means, over 50%. I think they had something like, I don't know, 38% or whatever in the most recent election. But in 1948, they staged a coup. They seized power, and they became a part of the Soviet-aligned states. And there was really very little resistance to this. And and again, that just shows the haplessness of Edward Beneš. So Beneš, who of course was the Czech leader at the time of the Munich conference. Again, Beneš didn't have to accept the diktat of the British and the French. The British and the French basically told him, hey, hand over the Sudetenland to Germany. He didn't have to do that, but he was kind of fairly useless and just simply went along with it, even though Czechoslovakia was not an insignificant military power in 1938. It could certainly have provided serious resistance to Nazi Germany, but he didn't. It provided no resistance at all, and Sudetenland was transferred to Germany. So again, in the same way, Beneš provided no resistance in 1948. So, and the same goes for Gustav Husak, who was he was the Minister of Defense at the time. The reason I bring up Gustav Husak, because Gustav Husak was the president of Czechoslovakia in 1968, when again Czechoslovakia provided no real resistance to the Soviet intervention. So it was a kind of it was, Beneš who kind of betrayed his country twice, 38-48, and then Gustav Husak kind of betrayed his country twice, 1948 and in 1968. But anyway, so Czechoslovakia really hadn't shown any particular courage through all of those years of communism, and or as I say, courage in confronting Germany. Nonetheless, got very lucky by not really resisting Hitler. Basically, Czechoslovakia really didn't suffer any destruction. One of the few states in Eastern Europe that suffered no destruction during World War II. I think as A.J.P. Taylor famously said, he was being sarcastic. He said that Czechoslovakia was betrayed at Munich, but survived more or less intact. Poland was saved in 1939, but was completely destroyed during the war. So you choose which is which is preferable. But anyway, that they didn't really provide too much resistance, other than in '68, which itself was somewhat belated, because it was really a belated response to the thaw, the so-called thaw that Khrushchev had launched back really in the late 1950s and early 1960s. There was a thaw in the Soviet Union. Czechoslovakia didn't really respond for many years. They had the kind of a fairly orthodox communist leader, Novotny. And then finally in '68, they began this whole liberalization, not really realizing that the era of liberalization of the sort of communism with a human face and a more liberal, tolerant, pragmatic communism was already long gone. Khrushchev was gone. There was the thaw in the early '60s. 1964, Nikita Khrushchev was removed, and a kind of a much more orthodox leadership took over. in the Soviet Union. So Czechoslovakia just got it wrong, and not really realizing that the Soviets now were going to look with a very jaundiced eye on any kind of liberalization in Czechoslovakia. And of course, within a few months, Dubček and the people around Dubček led their country to disaster. They kind of didn't really do much for 20 years until the fall of the Berlin Wall. They took their winnings, and but the basic differences between the Czechs and the Slovaks are sort of the cultural, historical differences. The Austria-Hungary really manifested themselves, and I think you see this now with the good relations that exist between Robert Fico and Orban. That's not to say that there've always been good relations between Slovak and the Hungarians, because in the era, it was about 20, 25, 30 years ago, when they had that Slovak populist Metzia, who was a leader there. He was very anti-Hungarian. So it could change at a dime that the Slovaks could suddenly turn ferociously against the Hungarians, because there's still a substantial Hungarian minority living in Slovakia, and the Slovaks are indeed very nervous about these Hungarians. I mean, it's I can't remember what the numbers are, but it's around 600,000 Hungarians who live there. Slovakia is much smaller than Hungary. I mean, the population of Slovakia is only about 4 million, and that's including the Hungarians. Hungary is a population of 10 million. So the Slovaks are always very nervous about the Hungarians, because they can't really take them off, and the Hungarians can become extremely nationalistic. They're known for their intense nationalism and patriotic fervor. So they're always nervous about it, and so that's why when this guy Metzia was very anti-Hungarian, and there's for years and years, there was very uneasy relations between Slovakia and Hungary. But now, in this era of Orban and Fico, they have common interests, which is they both are opposed to the EU NATO policy on Ukraine, and that draws them together. They both need energy from Russia. They're very much opposed to sending arms to Ukraine. They're opposed to the energy policy of just cutting yourself off from Russian energy. So they basically are drawn together. All the questions which come up in the past. Hey, we got this the big Hungarian minority in Slovakia, and the Hungarians are real troublemakers. All that's just put right behind the back burner. No one talks about it. Orban doesn't talk about it. Fico doesn't talk about it. They've got a common interest now, which is to oppose this NATO policy on Ukraine. But as I say, it could change. Fico could be removed. If Fico were removed and somebody was to take over from him, I will bet you anything. I will bet you anything that in no time at all, that new leader will bring up the issue of the Hungarians. He will absolutely, because he'd be an absolute Western puppet. This would be a color revolution, and he would be encouraged to make trouble with the Hungarians. And he'll say, "Oh, the Hungarians are, being really difficult. They're working for the Russians. They're disloyal." And he would be absolutely encouraged, much like the Baltic states are always encouraged to pursue anti-Russian policies against their substantial Russian minorities. So here, whoever comes after Fico will be encouraged to pursue a very anti-Hungarian policy. So now, and the question then is, so the Czechs are, the pro-US. Yeah, the Czechs are kind of they're pro-US. They're pro whoever is whoever's kind of dominant. They say, well, the Americans are the top dog, so they support the Americans. But again, if you go back to the era of 1945 to 1948, Banish, he was the leader of Czechoslovakia at the time of Munich, and he left the country and went into exile in Great Britain. During the years of exile, he spent all his time complaining how he was betrayed by the British. The British had come, even though he was living in exile in Britain, he spent all his time complaining about how the British had betrayed him. Even though, as I say, there was no real reason for him to accept the Munich Agreement. But then he returned after 1945 to Czechoslovakia, and then he adopted a very pro-Soviet line. Czechoslovakia was not pro-Soviet between the wars. On the contrary, it was part of the Little Entente, which was anti-German and anti-Soviet. He was definitely not pro-Soviet then. But he became very pro-Soviet after 1945, and somehow thought, oh, well, the Soviets, they had supported us. They didn't betray us. So he did that. He did that again in 1948. Boom, and then it was this time. It was he lost his country to the Soviet Union. So he then decided that the Soviet Union is the coming thing, and he suddenly became very pro-Soviet. Just as before, between the wars, he was kind of pro-British. So yeah, that's I think that's that could explain why the Czechs are pro-American. They see that the Americans are the power, and they're supporting them. But your other question: do you expect that Orban will try to use his influence with Trump to put a stop to this coup? I think he probably will, but I don't know whether Trump will particularly be interested in that. I mean, that's really he's got a lot of things on his plate, and I think he has very vague ideas about who and what Slovakia is. So I don't know whether it would interest him that much. He likes Orban. I mean, that's it. He likes his personality. Orban was an early supporter of his, so he remembers that. Somebody who was very loyal to him from the beginning. So he likes all of that. But how much he's going to lean on people within his State Department against in any potential coup against Fico, I don't know. But I would imagine Orban would definitely raise that issue about they're planning a new Maidan in Slovakia, but I just don't know how much how influential he'll be on that. It's kind of interesting. That's an interesting question. Dr. Nostrum says Czechoslovakia is formerly part of some combination of the German Empire and the Austro-Hungarian Empire. It, along with a bunch of other countries, was conjured into existence by the British and French following World War I. The UK was still interested in expanding the empire, despite the fact that it was losing money by the end of the 19th century. England and France also carved up the Middle East. Yeah, no, I think that's right. I mean, the problem with the Middle East, the English and the French could actually rule over the various unruly tribes. In the case of the dissolution of the Austro-Hungarian Empire, the Ottoman Empire, the German Empire, and of course the Russian Empire, is that now suddenly new nations came into being, and they were then pushed into creating rather artificial states. You couldn't go back to Austria-Hungary, so you had to create an alternative to Austria-Hungary, like Czechoslovakia, Yugoslavia, and Romania. But it was always very difficult because they weren't exactly very easily combined. I mean, obviously Yugoslavia was a particular problem. Even between the wars, the Croats really hated the Serbs, and it was something that was easily then exploited by Hitler. But even in Czechoslovakia, you had the Bohemian Moravia, the sort of the Czech part, which was pro British, pro French, and then you had Slovakia, which became, after the collapse of Czechoslovakia, Slovakia under Father Tiso, essentially a Nazi satellite state. So they have, these states broke up, and then they have different alliances. So you have, like, just as you had Croatia, became also a Nazi satellite state. Anyway, Dr. Nostran, so okay, so we've got children born to diplomats do not get citizenship. No, that's exactly right. Children born to diplomats do not get citizenship because diplomats are explicitly not subject to the jurisdiction of the state. So therefore, since they're specifically citizens of another country and subject to the jurisdiction of another country, therefore, any children born to diplomats do not get citizenship. Yeah. Marty, always very good to see you. Merry Thursday, George and Gagglers. Always very good to see you. Then we got Dr. Nostran says the Hamas Charter declares the entire region is given by the Arabs by Allah. Both sides are thumping their respective books. The original mandate included Jordan, but no, well, Jordan was separate. No, the mandate, the mandate applied to Palestine. Transjordan was a separate state. So there were these two separate entities, which was the British Mandate of Palestine, and then you had the Kingdom of Transjordan. The Balfour Declaration applied exclusively to the British Mandate of Palestine. The Balfour Declaration did not apply to Transjordan. That was a separate entity. I promised the West the Jews. Yes, the message. Yeah, I mean that was it. I mean, it was the message British imperialism. Well, British imperialism, but the separate. There was a separate issue there. There was, yes, the British kind of took the Ottoman Empire collapsed. The British took the remnants of it, but within that, there was a separate issue, which was the Balfour Declaration and the promise to create a Jewish national homeland. And so you could do regular imperialism. If it was just regular imperialism, the British might or might not have succeeded. They would have probably succeeded in some aspects, would not have succeeded in other aspects, as was the case with their other imperial projects, with the India and whatever. What was particular about the Middle East is that they had this much more traditional imperialism, or this territory that they had inherited, and you had the Balfour Declaration, and then they started very seriously fulfilling the terms of the Balfour Declaration, and that's what really created the huge problems for the British, because they were trying to balance two things. The promise that they had made to the Jews, and then the promise that they had made to the various Arab leaders. And Cynthia, always very good to see you. Thank you so much, Cynthia, as always, for your generosity. And Cynthia says, the Danish government denies that one of their pilots was killed in Ukraine, but doesn't deny that they have pilots training Ukrainian pilots to fly F-16s in Ukraine. That is always so typical. They can never admit that one of their military personnel was killed in Ukraine, because that would be a very serious one, because that would suggest that they're actually actively involved in the fighting. So if they, but they pass their words and suggest, well, we're just involved in training, therefore we are not a party to the conflict. But if you start admitting that you got killed, then you sort of are a party to the conflict. This seems like yet another attempt by the West to underreport its casualties, yes, casualty numbers, in order to prevent anyone from knowing that it's losing the war, with the hope that it won't become an even more unpopular war, yeah. But that's wrong-headed, because when the truth comes out, all wars will become unpopular, will become so unpopular that the West won't dare to wage one without a fight. It's a very, very interesting issue. The way governments get around this particular problem that you highlight here is, well, you first of all, you lie about it, and then you say, oh no, what we're doing is we're training. Oh no, we're just showing them how you use these weapons. We're not doing their fighting. No, we're definitely not going to do their fighting. But if because of course, if people suddenly realize, hey, our soldiers are involved in this fighting, and there's never been any kind of authorization for this. There's never been an election fought on this issue of getting directly involved in Ukraine. There's been no parliamentary vote to send our servicemen to fight in Ukraine. Then there'll be a lot of outrage about this. So the question then is, well, you have to pretend that it didn't happen. And then when Russia does something, and you say, Russia's killed all these, NATO soldiers. Then you say, well, now, we got to do something. So you kind of surreptitiously get yourself sucked into this war by being essentially saying, well, look, we can't just walk away now, because if we walk away now, then Russia has won. Russia has killed our nationals. We have to respond. We have to do something. We can't just allow them to kill our nationals with impunity. That's how they always do it. So it always starts off with, oh, we're just doing some training. We're not getting involved in any direct fighting. But then you got a point where, hey, now our credibility is on the line. I mean, in a way, it's similar to kind of the way to what happened in Vietnam. I mean, Vietnam was a little different, but it was kind of a step-by-step process of getting sucked into the war. And so, there were plenty of people in the 1950s and early 1960s who were expressing concern about America's growing involvement in Vietnam. And the government was saying, no, all we're doing in Vietnam is helping the South Vietnamese defend themselves. We're just doing training. We're providing them with weapons. We're showing them how they use the weapons. We're not doing the fighting. We're not, absolutely never. We're not going to do the fighting for them. Asian boys have to fight the wars that in Asia. Not Europeans don't fight Asian wars. And of course, it was a lie. But once you're in beyond a certain amount, then there's nothing you can do. You can't just walk out with your tail between your legs. So that's why this step-by-step process is always so dangerous, because then there's always comes a moment where you can't walk away. That's why you have to watch the way all this talk about peacekeepers. Oh, we have to send the European peacekeepers. This is the drumbeat. We need European peacekeepers, because we have to provide Ukraine with some guarantees. So we have the peacekeepers. That word peacekeepers, it sounds good. Oh, well, that's good. Well, of course, what's wrong with sending some peacekeepers? They're not doing any harm. But of course they are doing harm, because these peacekeepers are there in order to provoke a war. That's the function of them. They're not going to be there as observing a ceasefire. That's all. They're peacekeepers. It depends on what you mean by peace. I mean, it's like, Annalena Baerbock, who says, every day I'm working for peace by sending more and more weapons to Ukraine. That's how I do it for peace. So that were peacekeepers. Well, if these peacekeepers are there to provide peace by essentially provoking a conflict. So I mean, that's something the way it goes. Come on, George. Dr. Nostrum said, live virus vaccines, yes, they exist. Inject either DNA or RNA into human cells. Vaccines are all about training the immune system, except, of course, that they don't. That's the point. They don't. They didn't do anything to the immune system. We saw what the mRNA vaccines, they weakened the immune system. They provided no defense against a virus. So that's the point. I mean, that's the vaccines are we're sold a bill of goods. There are reasons why diseases have been extirpated from many countries. You reach a level of science, you reach a level of cleanliness, hygiene, public health, public sanitation, and that's how you basically eliminate diseases. It had nothing to do with vaccines. I mean, vaccines can do a certain amount of good, but very, very minimal amount. It's just simply you have the improvement in public health that made the difference. Now, yeah, there are these diseases, the childhood diseases, and so on. And how do people cope with the childhood diseases? Well, through building your natural immunity system. The natural immunity, which of course is much stronger and much more effective than the immunity, supposed immunity from vaccines, which is why so much of research on vaccine has been so completely pointless, because they never achieved it. For very obvious reasons, that the viruses that the vaccines are designed against, the viruses are continually mutating. So you've designed a vaccine against the virus, but by the time you're applying the vaccine, the virus has mutated. It's already, the vaccine is no longer effective against that virus. I mean, imagine all the years that they devoted under Fauci, they devoted all those years to researching a vaccine against HIV. Total waste of time, total waste of money, never went anywhere. Didn't do anything at all. That's all the anti-HIV vaccine. I mean, eventually they were able to deal with HIV, but also in all sorts of ways. But they never through vaccines. So it's a total. I mean, it's not a holier dud. I mean, vaccines have their uses, but the fetish of vaccines, when people don't realize all the issues, all the different things that have been done to eliminate diseases, which have nothing to do with vaccines. So this thing is just being put by, you're being sold a bill of goods. So anyone who really believes, oh, they're going to develop a vaccine against cancer. Does anyone really believe that if you spend, $500,000, get an injection, and that's going to make you immune to cancer? Come on. Anyway, Anne-Marie, always good to see you. Thank you so much, Anne-Marie, for your generosity. So Anne-Marie is, of course, our resident musical expert, and always her commentary on music, on the Music Club is very much worth reading. I'm always learning from it. So thank you very much, Anne-Marie. Dr. Nostrum says energy prices are up in the U.S. However, the real production costs of gas and oil continue to increase. So drill, baby, drill is at best an economic band-aid. Okay. And then so Marty says, I took this photograph at the Euro airport in Basel. What does it say? So Pharma AI. Oh, that's it. Yeah, that's it. Okay, that's good. And then Robert says, it's hard to see how Trump's embrace of such a great expansion of mRNA project will sit well with mRNA skeptic RFK Jr. Very much so. I don't think it's going to be at all. I mean, if RFK was watching that, I mean, he would have been absolutely appalled. I mean, the idea that the administration is talking about an anti-cancer vaccine. I mean, that's just it's like nightmarish. But on the other hand, I'm not sure. Unfortunately, I'm not sure whether RFK is going to make it through the confirmation process because he has opponents. I mean, the Democrats, to a man or woman, will vote against him, and he has uh, has problems with the Republicans. So I don't know whether too many Republicans are going to support him, or at least whether he's got enough votes to get him over the top. So I don't know whether RFK is going to make it. But yeah, it is really peculiar. I mean, he goes for Trump to talk about, well, we'll make America healthy again. In other words, we're going to start, getting minimizing our addiction to vaccines. And again, in particular, the issue with the vaccines, which is the one raised by RFK, and before that with who was that? Ben Carson, the Dr. Ben Carson, said, well, there's just been such a proliferation of vaccines. They just use, it used to be just you got one against smallpox and one against measles. But now, I mean, there's just there's so many of them, and therefore you have to then wonder what is it doing? The health that it's the health consequences of applying so many vaccines, and above all, that applying so many vaccines just weakens the immunity system. That the natural immunity system is being undermined by the application of so many vaccines. I think, and that was again before Kennedy. It was Ben Carson who raised that issue in 2016. Nostrum says, George, it will be comparatively easy for the Russian economy to recover as Russia is not deindustrialized the way that the US and parts of Europe are. Well, yes, it will be comparatively easy, but depending on, of course, on how much economic activity will still be permissible for Russia. Losing the European market is not a good idea. I mean, then you become dependent on the Asian market, and the Asians have their own agenda. So we'd have to say now. Yeah, I mean they have industry, but they have there are always limitations on their industry, particularly in the cutting edge industries, which is obviously computers, internet, AI, bioengineering, and all this kind of thing. So well, obviously we'll have to see. The sanctions regime I don't think it should be minimized. I think it is going to have an effect because it's having an effect on third parties. If you just apply the sanctions against Russia, then say, okay, the Russians can ignore it. But if the sanctions regime induces India, China, the Central Asian countries, the Kazakhstan, Kyrgyzstan, Azerbaijan, gradually to shift away from doing business with Russia, I think it'll have an effect. Anyway, where are we? Where can I go? Oh, here we are. Dr. also says Trump has a domestic program that he wants to push through. That sort of thing typically takes place during the first 100 days the president's office. Trump may simply want Ukraine out of the news for 100 days. Trump may be trying to shift responsibility to Ukraine and Western Europe. After 6 months or so, Congress critters will negotiate final text for bills and planning their re-election campaign. I have no doubt that Trump would like this Ukraine war to disappear. I have no doubt that he doesn't have any interest in this war and that he would like to focus on domestic issues. But that's not really necessarily an option that you can pursue. I mean, it's the same with any political leaders. Yeah, you don't want this war. You want to focus on domestic issues, but you may not be able to. It's the same with Lyndon Johnson. Yeah, I'm sure Lyndon Johnson, that the war, that was Vietnam War, that wasn't what he was necessarily what he was interested in. He did have a domestic program, and he did pursue the domestic program, but the key was that if you can't get out of a war, if that you don't have any easy way of resolving this issue, then it's going to overwhelm you. It's going to overwhelm, and there's not going to be no one's going to be paying any attention to your domestic program if you've got a war that you can't bring to any satisfactory conclusion. And I think that's going to be the problem, because if Trump essentially pursues the Biden program both in Ukraine and in the Middle East, his presidency will fail. And his presidency will fail much like his first term failed, because he's going to be stuck with this war, costly and dangerous, and one that, the issue that most people are paying most attention to. I mean, even now, you can see when he gives these news conferences, most of the questions are about Ukraine. So, yeah, no doubt he wants this war to go away. No doubt he would like to focus on his domestic agenda. He may not get it. And if he doesn't get it, then it will be another failed presidency. And then Lynn says, good to see you, Lynn. Lynn says, yes, and RFK Jr. has good grasp on Ukraine. I thought it is. This is in response to Robert's point about it's hard to see how Trump's embrace of mRNA projects will sit well with RFK Jr. And then Lynn says, yeah, RFK Jr. has a good grasp on Ukraine. Is Trump listening? Probably not. I mean, Trump is his, he's the boss. He's very sure of himself, and he's not going to listen to anyone, unless he has to. He clearly thinks he has a better judgment on most things than anyone else. I mean, you saw him last night when he was being interviewed by Sean Hannity, and then Hannity sort of was telling him, "Well, can we now move on to talking about the economy? Because we're limit. Our time is limited." And Trump said, "I don't care. I want to talk about what I want to talk about. That this is important. What I'm saying. He just said, I don't care. Just that's it. So I think." Trump thinks he's the boss. And then Alex says, George, you didn't talk about the state you need to get up today. Russia's doing fine, 4% growth, low debt, GDP. This stuff is like what's important about the Russian economy. Russian is suffering considerable inflation, and it has a very high interest rates. This business, the 700 billion in the central banks, not including the 300 billion stolen over 150 trillion lira, not including the 300 billion. Well, why even talk about the 300 billion? They're not coming back. And so this, okay, you can claim the Russian economy is doing well. The Russians themselves are not making that claim. So I mean, it's just simply not the case. And the economic growth rate is actually less now than it was last year. But either way, you have to then say, how is it going to fare in the near future? As I say, you've got the sanctions, which are not going to go away. You have the inflation. You have the inflation is coming around because Russia is spending huge amounts of money on waging this war, and hence the interest rates. If you could bring this war to a swift conclusion, it wouldn't be a problem. But if this war is going to continue another 2-3 years, then gradually it is going to become a serious problem. I just don't see any point in doing this kind of cheerful rah-rah commentary when even the Russians themselves are not saying this. Even Putin himself is saying we have serious economic issues. Glaziev is saying we have serious economic problems. So, and then anyway, Laura then says, at a 21% rate, eventually people in Russia will feel it in their pocket. Yeah, exactly. And it's happening now, which just means that businesses, it's leading to a slowdown in businesses. You can't have economic growth when you got 21% interest rates. Small and medium businesses that rely on credit to function pass that extra cost to the final consumer, yes. That's felt mostly on inelastic goods that everyone needs on a daily basis. A high rate also makes it more difficult to buy a car or a house, yes. Nabiulina, this is the head of the Russian central bank. Her monetarist approach to tackle inflation will freeze Russia's economy, destroying jobs, and people won't like it. And it's essentially a stagflation. You've got inflation and stagnation. You got the economy is not growing because of the high. Anyway, George, as Mark says, what about our man in the Kremlin, Alexander Mercouris? Since when has Alexander Mercouris been our man in the Kremlin? He lives in London. He claims to be receiving information regarding the production of the Oreshnik missile, where they are being produced, and when they will be used next, plus a new secret missile that he said he couldn't disclose further. Yeah, well, we've already seen the whole point of, and we talked about this before, the whole point of this Oreshnik missile was supposed to intimidate NATO. NATO was not intimidated. And in fact, basically, it was a kind of a dud, the whole Oreshnik missile. But in any case, if they use the Oreshnik missile against Ukraine, well, then what have you accomplished? You basically, again, if this time you use live rounds, live missiles, which you didn't do last time, you're going on still fighting against Ukraine. The whole point was to intimidate NATO from continuing with its proxy war against Russia. I mean, that was the whole point, that this was after the Ukraine had been given the go-ahead to use ATACMS missiles on Russian territory, deep inside Russian territory, and then we had this attack from the Oreshnik, and the assumption was that, well, this is a way to intimidate NATO. NATO wasn't intimidated, and so now your next task is that you're going to hit Ukraine with Oreshniks. Well, what's the point of that? I mean, Russia doesn't have a shortage of missiles. It can use all of the different missiles. All the Kinjal missiles. I mean, it has so much artillery shell. It doesn't need anything additional. You don't need a super missile to lob at Ukraine. So it's sort of kind of fairly pointless when you're coming up with a solution to a problem that you don't have. Russia doesn't have a problem of a shortage of missiles. It does have a problem of not really figuring out how it can bring this war to a satisfactory conclusion. Laura Ott says that plus extra sanctions that make it more difficult for Russia to sell gas and oil can become an ugly mix. I agree completely. I think, Laura, you put it very, very well, excellently. Yeah, thank you. Mark says Russia is a self-sufficient country. Squeeze Russia out of the world market would collapse the world economy. No, it won't collapse the world economy. Russia can indeed run a self-sufficient economy. Well, in other words, it can go back to the Soviet era. If it goes back to the Soviet era, then the entire post-1991 experiment will have failed, because now exactly which was the whole point of removing communism, getting rid of the whole Soviet Leninist command economy model, was that Russia would be integrated into the world economy. If I would say, well, yeah, we are autarkic, we can basically run a self-sufficient economy, then yeah, then essentially you're going to go back to the Soviet era. And I don't know, and I don't think that's what the Russian people want. I just don't. There's no. Oh yeah, now we're going to cut ourselves off again from the rest of the world, and we're just going to be self-sufficient. That's not what the Russian people want, and I don't think there's going to be any bias. I mean, if any Russian leader who proposes that self-sufficiency, I don't think it will last. I just don't. This is not, the Russians today are not the Russians of the 1920s. That I think they want to be a part of the world economy. They want to be a part of world markets. They want to do their shopping in London and Paris. They want to trade with everyone in the world. They're not going to go back to the sort of Stalinist command economy. So Marx says the test firing of the Oreshnik appears to have been highly successful, but it is overkill for the current conflict. Russia is likely to gearing up production of stockpiling the things for use in the case of NATO intervention. Well, I think that's I mean, that part I agree with, that that the NATO intervention is a real possibility. That's unlikely, but it's a serious possibility. You have to prepare for that. With all this talk about these peacekeepers, which I think is just simply a backdoor for some kind of NATO intervention, yeah, then Russia has to think about that. But whether you need Oreshnik or you need anything else, Russia has it. Russia already has. There's no shortage of weapons. There's a shortage of strategy, of strategic thinking, but there's no shortage of weapons. You don't need anything very fancy. Yeah. The Russia-Ukrainian war is also a significant drain on the United States. No, it's not. Just don't agree with that. It's not a significant. The United States has barely broken a sweat over this. The U.S. economic problems have absolutely nothing to do with the Ukraine war. I mean, they have had an effect in Europe. That I would agree that that it has a significant impact on Europe, because Europe is not an energy producer, and therefore Europe has to import its energy. Europe is suffering through having to pay far more for its energy than it was before 2022. But the United States is doing very well. It's actually found new markets for its LNG, and it's getting paid very well by the Europeans. So its military industrial complex is humming. There's a nice lavish market for its LNG products. So I think the war has done very well for the Americans. The Europeans, I think, are really suffering, not just through the lack of productivity because of the high energy costs of the German economy, and the German economy is the powerhouse of the European economy. That's obviously been a really negative factor, but also domestically. I mean, I told you what it is here in Hungary. I mean, it's cold. It's not even that cold. But they're hitting you, just absolutely punishing you for using excess gas. I mean, there's staggering amount these bills that they're presenting. You can't afford it. You can't even afford essentially to go through a winter without freezing to death in your own home. So that it's absolutely hurting the Europeans. It's not hurting the Americans. Um, Russia, and then Mark says Russia was making a statement to the USA. We are light years ahead in missile technology. All right, well, go on. You can go on saying what you like. The question is, are people listening, and do people take it seriously? I don't see it. I frankly absolutely see no. It triggered no change whatsoever in U.S. policy. None. The U.S. continued to sanction Ukraine using the ATACMS missiles. So if this was a warning shot, don't use ATACMS missiles on Russian territory. This is our red line. Don't do this stuff in Kursk. Kursk. That's it's a red line. On the contrary, the Americans have increased their use of the ATACMS missiles, or they've increased their approvals of Ukrainians using ATACMS missiles. And above all, the Americans have been helping Ukraine in Kursk, in other red lines. So the Oreshnik has had no impact whatsoever, any change in U.S. policy. Anyway. Dr. Nostrum says, George, creating polyethnic pseudo-states was a major element in British imperialism. Yeah, no, I mean, I don't disagree with that. I mean, I think the issue in Europe was different. The issue in Europe was to create a system. This was a part of the concert of powers, was to create a system to hem in Germany, to create a kind of contain Germany and to contain the Soviet Union, which I think that was different. I mean, here in the case of the Arab world, it was more like, well, how do we go on exploiting the resources of this Arab world? So we need to create, leaders who will play ball with us. But in Europe, this was a part of, how do we create a stable system now that all these empires have dissolved? How do we create a stable system? Above all, they have to worry about a revanchist Germany, that Germany is going to get tired of the restrictions that were placed on it by Versailles, and above all, the Soviet Union and the threat of communism that was emanating from the Soviet Union. So they created this little entente of these little states that supposedly, in alliance with Britain and France, would be able to contain Germany and the Soviet Union. Of course, they didn't. The moment Hitler began to push against that system of states, that system collapsed. So I think it's a little different. I mean, obviously there are similarities, but the goal of what was done in Europe was different from the Middle East. I mean, these were not empires. I mean, this wasn't part of a British empire. The British never had any. There was no history of ever Britain ruling over any part of the European continent. Mark says EU is being deindustrialized, factories moving to the US and China at the same time, charging EU a small fortune for gas. Yeah, that's right. These Americans are doing very well. Europeans are absolutely getting hammered. George, I know about Transjordan. It really was part of the original mandate, but it was carved off by the British early on. Jordan will also follow the British imperial pattern. As a minority family, it was elevated to the throne. Yeah. And then says America was bogged down in Afghanistan for 20 years. $3 trillion was spent only to replace the Taliban with the Taliban. Yeah, but it didn't really. Again, America barely broke a sweat. Now, I think there's a very good argument to be made and I agree with it very much, that this is an absolute wasteful, totally wasteful use of precious American resources. This is taxpayer money that was thrown away on a ridiculous venture in Afghanistan. I mean, there's no question about that. Um, and until there's some kind of accountability in the United States, and America's going to keep doing this. 3 trillion, 5 trillion, 10 trillion. No, everyone just loses count because nobody really cares. But of course, this is money, this is resources that are being extracted from Americans and wasted on these kinds of stupid, pointless ventures as Afghanistan. But in terms of, did America suffer any great losses? And didn't really suffer any losses. Rich people continued to get richer. The poor, well, nobody really cares much about them. Anyway. Dr. Nelson says the nightly casualty reports from the Vietnam War were infamously vaporware. At one point, people were claiming that if you added up reported Viet Cong deaths, it would exceed the general population. Of course, absolutely. Absolutely right. This was idiotic, absolutely ridiculous numbers. And they were undertaken, that there was this assumption. Again, this was a war of attrition. And the Americans had this theory of a war of attrition that the Viet Cong was sustaining casualties of such magnitude that they would be unable to continue fighting this war. Not unlike what we're hearing about in Ukraine. It's always a war of attrition. They won't be able to sustain it. Well, they might sustain it for quite a long time. I mean, while these numbers, it's true, the numbers about Viet Cong losses were exaggerating. They were taking a serious pounding. I mean, there's no question. They took a big hit. I mean, the huge casualties. The Viet Cong and the North Vietnamese. They suffered huge casualties, even though the theory underlying it that they would eventually collapse and wouldn't be able to continue the war was false. They could continue the war. But yeah, I mean, they were also vastly exaggerated, much like the war in Ukraine, which again, both sides have suffered huge casualties, but the numbers are wildly exaggerated. Like Trump was talking about these numbers, millions are dead. So that's all nonsense. But the casualties are real. Anyway, where are we? So where are we? Good. Where are we? Dr. Nelson says George polio and smallpox were taken out by vaccines, and that it played a role. There were many other factors that played a role. It's been exaggerated in saying, "Oh, it was the vaccines that did it." No, there were a lot of things that got rid of these terrible diseases, and you can say because a lot of other places where these diseases just decline, where public health became an important factor. I mean, if you have clean water, you basically remove bacteria from clean water. Where you have a safe and clean sewage and the general cleanliness on the part of the population, but especially the cleanliness through municipal activity. Yeah, that's how diseases decline. I mean, the idea that somehow, oh no, it was just an injection, that's what caused it. The vaccines, they played a role. The most important role was played by the enormous increase in public health. Um, and and then Tony Blair surfaced in Davos interviewing a head chopper from Syria. I saw that. Surely the cat's out of the bag, proving that head choppers are owned by the West. Yeah, I agree with that. Anne Marie says, I have to say that Musk's alleged Hitler salute at the Trump inauguration looked quite disturbing to me. Why do you think he behaved the way he did? And do you think he really meant it to be as it appeared? Um, I don't know. It was a very strange gesture. I mean, I tend to think that all this is, uh, these things are always wildly exaggerated by the media. The gesture was that somehow he did it from the heart. So he put his hand to his heart, and then he kind of lifted up his arm, and then he did that. And then he did it the second time. He put his hand on his heart and then lifted up as if somehow he was sending out his love to the crowd. Um, it was an awkward gesture, but I find it very difficult to believe that he intended to do a Nazi salute. I mean, what would be the point? Why would he want to do that? It's that I don't know. Just there's nothing in anything in his in his thinking that would suggest that he's has any fondness for Hitler and the Nazis. I remember when he did that interview with Alice Weidel, the leader of the Alternative for Deutschland. I remember what they were talking about, and which is the argument she was making to him, and he obviously seemed to accept it. He said, well, Hitler was a socialist. Hitler was a communist. We, however, are libertarians. We are libertarian conservatives. And she was saying this, and he was agreeing with her. So that I think is what Musk's thinking is. Well, he's also a libertarian conservative, and I think that's. I just don't see that he has any particular affiliation or a fondness for the Nazis. Now, the way it came across was it was a little silly. The trouble is that this happens all the time. That anybody, some figure was on the right, and then raises his arm, and then right away, boom, it goes viral on YouTube and everything. Oh, look, he raised his arm in a Hitler salute. You look at Laura Ingraham, who was at the 2016 Republican conference, and she was kind of waving to the crowd, and she kind of kept her arm up and was and kind of was making a kind of a semicircular movement with her arm, and right away, oh, Laura Ingraham is doing the Hitler salute. So I just don't, I find it very, however awkward the gesture was, but he is kind of an awkward person. It's very strange. He talks in a very awkward way. So I just tend to think that it was an awkward gesture that didn't come off. He's not a good public speaker. He kind of, he mumbles. He's not at all particularly articulate. And I just think that whatever gesture he was trying to make, and I think he was just trying to say, hey, I have love, love in my heart, and he wants to share it with everyone. Then it's it just came across as awkwardly. I'm in a different way. I remember kind of Novak Djokovic. He used to have this awkward gesture of he wanted to show about love. He had this love for the crowds, and then he would take this love from his heart, and then he would just basically throw, as if he's sending love from his heart to each part. So all four corners of the court, and it just looked cringeworthy. I mean, it wasn't. I mean, no one thought it was a Nazi gesture, but it was cringeworthy, which just shows that some people just don't have a sense of how awkward and ridiculous certain gestures look. So, but you know, I'm not buying that he meant it in any Nazi Hitlerian way. Anyway, Mark says to Anne-Marie, that was a Roman salute, is also part of Star Trek. Yeah, I don't think he intended as a Roman salute. I think he was doing this. Hey, I'm sending my love from my heart to the crowd. It just came across as a little cringeworthy. Anytime, you know, oh, I'm sending love from my heart. I think it just looks awful. Danaki says, as Mark Twain would say, news of Europe's death by deindustrialization has been greatly exaggerated. I've been hearing now from the Duran and all sorts of Xenoners how Germany's dusted for at least 3 years now, and I still see a whole lot of Mercedes, Audis, and BMWs on the street. Yeah, no, I think that's fair. I remember when we had the first winter. This was the. Well, no, I guess if you count 2022, February 2022, that's still winter. But the winter that was coming, 2022 through to 2023, in other words, the winter of 2023, you know, we had Scott Ritter on, and he was predicting that the total economic collapse in Europe, you know, there'll be no food, there'll be no heating, and there'll be mass rioting in all the cities of Europe. That was in January, February, I guess, of 2023. That never happened. And I think there's been too many of these apocalyptic pronouncements about this. This is it. This is going to be a total collapse, mass rioting. You know, none of that even remotely happened. But I mean, I still think that it has caused hardships, and it has hugely increased energy costs, but the idea that it's going to collapse, no. Dr. Nostrum says, good grief, George, go look at the famous 1964 Johnson countdown advertisement. I don't know what that's appropriate, what that's apropos. Keep in mind also about that advertisement, no one ever saw it. It was never shown. So yes, that was the famous one about the girl with the daisies, you know, she's throwing the daisies into the pool, and then suddenly Goldwater's, you know, somebody's going 10, 9, 8, 7, as if Goldwater's obviously a threat of nuclear war. I don't know what you're referring to when you make that point, but a couple of things. I say nobody ever saw that ad. It was designed by Bill Moyers, who was a flack for LBJ, and Goldwater had opened himself up to this kind of an attack, but with a lot of reckless talk, and I think. You know, we had a very interesting post on our Gaggle locals page, an interview of Nixon with Frank Gannon, and Frank Gannon asked Nixon what he thought of Goldwater, and Nixon said, well, you know, Goldwater, you know, he was, you know, he did a lot of reckless talking. You know, he basically was shooting his mouth off. Well, you don't do that in politics. You know, if you shoot your mouth off and start suggesting that you're ready to start bombing Russia, then you know your political opponents are going to say you are a threat to world peace, and then you're gonna lead to nuclear annihilation. And Goldwater really didn't do anything to temper this kind of talk. I mean, he didn't do anything to reassure the public that he's not going to do that. It's like he just continued even during the 1964 campaign with a lot of loose blustery talk. So he was absolutely fair game for that that advertisement. But however, as I say, no one ever saw that advertisement. They decided not to run it. They Goldwater was already beaten, so they decided not to run with that ad. So anyway, um, um, and then Danaki says, go to your local Lidl if you have if you have one, and count how many products are German made. A lot, and Eastern Europeans that keep buying them like hot cross buns. That's very true. I don't like Lidl, yeah, but most of the stuff is indeed German made. And Marty posts a picture of Ursula von der Leyen. He has the tools. When I was reading all these stories a couple of weeks ago about how seriously she was ill and she was out of action, my hopes were raised a little bit. I thought, oh, could we be, an early, a kind of a late Christmas present? But it seems like she's on the mend. So, oh well. Okay. Okay. So, Dr. Nostrom says during World War II, the mathematicians responsible for modeling war material needs were multiplying what the model was predicting by a factor of 10 when reports of shortages were coming back. The US paid its war debt in a few years and restarted consumer production over about a year or so. Yes, Russia is currently experiencing economic problems, but Russia is largely self-sufficient, the same way the US was back during World War II. China and India are on the US crosshairs regardless. Yeah, but I mean, the US had a captive world market in 1945. I mean, it was just, I mean, every other economy had been absolutely shattered by World War II. So basically, it was just, the US had barely been blooded. It was easily the biggest industrial economy in the world, and so the world was a captive market for it. So that hence the glorious years of from 1945 through to about 1970 for the American economy. I don't think Russia is in that position. Um, uh, um, so. Okay. Um, okay. Yeah. So anyway, I think I'm kind of about done now. So thank you everybody who has joined me. Thank you for all your very interesting comments and criticisms and points. It was very, very stimulating and very enjoyable. So we're into the weekend now. So we're going to do some podcasts with Peter over the weekend. And then we're going to do the live stream with Peter on Monday, 10 a.m. Eastern Time. And then Tuesday, 3 p.m., my solo. Thank you, everybody who joined me. Thank you, above all, to those who contributed to the tip jar, because that's really the important thing. And the dogs, they're not in a good mood. With this winter, it doesn't agree with them. So they look at the tip jar and that just puts them into a really foul mood. So, but anyway, thank you so much. I'll have to deal with them at some point. So remember, if you like the Gaggle, please like, share, and subscribe. See you very soon. All the best. Bye-bye.